Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time, we will continue our reading of Village Affairs by Miss Reed. Half-term came and went, and a long spell of dark weather with pouring rain and high winds set in. School playtimes became an endurance test for all. Deprived of their usual exercise in the playground, the children became cross with their enforced incarceration. The tattered comics reappeared, the jigsaw puzzles, the second-best sets of crayons, and the balls of plasticine, multi-hued by careless hands which had rolled various colors together, were brought out of the cupboard to try to assuage their frustration. It was uphill work to keep them happily occupied. The first colds of winter swept the classroom, and sneezes, sniffs, and coughs rent the air. A large box of tissues seemed to be exhausted in 2 days, and my pleas for them to bring their own or to bring a handkerchief fell on deaf ears. The tortoise stoves took to smoking, as they do when the wind gets into a certain quarter, and the skylight, as always, dripped steadily as the rain swept viciously across the playground. It was during this bleak period that I received another missive from the office. It informed me that due note had been taken of the findings of the managers' meeting held some time earlier, and that my own comments were being considered. It was only right to point out, it went on to say, that reorganization of the schools in the area was now advancing steadily, and that the possible closure of Fair Acre School could not be ruled out. Back to square one, I observed to Tibby, who was trifling with a portion of expensive cat food, much appreciated by the cat in the television advertisement, but not by my fastidious friend. Now what? I wondered. My problems were further complicated on the next Friday by Minnie Pringle's. My heart sank when I opened the door and heard the crash of the handbrush against the sitting room skirting board. Since Minnie's advent, all the skirting boards have been severely dented and now resemble hammered pewter. I think she feels that the edge of the carpet has not been properly cleaned without a hefty swipe at the skirting board with each movement. My remonstrances have made not the slightest impression, and I doubt if Minnie realizes the damage she is doing. At one stage, I forbade her to touch the handbrush, but that too was ignored. "You're working overtime, Minnie," I said. She looked up from her demolition work with a mad grin. "It don't matter. I ain't got nowhere to go." I took the brush from her hand and put it on the table. "You'd better sit down and tell me," I said resignedly. At least the skirting board was spared for a time, but I had no doubt that my nerves would take a similar pounding. Minnie sat at the extreme edge of a Victorian buttoned armchair, which, I knew from experience, was liable to tip forward abruptly if so used. "Sit back, Minnie," I advised her. She wriggled forward another 2 inches, and I gave up. With any luck, her light weight would not affect the chair's balance. "What's the matter now?" "It's Bert. Him and Ern has been fighting." "Can't you tell them to go? I gather it's your house now, or so your aunt says." Minnie's eyes grew round with horror. "Tell 'em to go," she echoed. "They don't take no notice of what I says. Anyway, Ern's gone." "Then what's the trouble? I thought Bert was a lodger, a paying guest, I mean, so surely you can give him notice if you want to." "He don't pay." "All the more reason for pushing him out." Minnie twisted her dirty fingers together unhappily. "It's not that. It's his hittin' me I don't like." "I thought you said it was Ern and Bert that were fighting." "Well, it was first off. Then when Ern went back to Caxley to give old Mrs. Fowler a piece of his mind, Bert turned sort of nasty and took a strap to me." I thought that "turned sort of nasty" was the understatement of the year if it involved attacking the minute Minnie with a strap. "Look here," I said, "I think you'd better have a word with Bert's employers at Springborn Manor. Let them speak to him." Minnie looked more horrified than ever. They'd give him the sack more like, and then he'd take it out on me. Horrible strong he is, Bert. I'd almost soon have Ern. He never used the strap. Well, you seem in a pretty pickle, I must say, I said severely. Why has Ern gone back to Caxley? I thought he had left Mrs. Fowler. She give him the push, and now he's hollerin' for the furniture what he pinched from our house. He reckons Mrs. Fowler's flogged it. Despair began to overtake me. Heaven knows I do my best to simplify my own life, and even so I am beset by irksome complications. To confront someone like Minnie, whose relationships with others are a hopeless tangle, makes my rational mind boggle. Where can one begin to help? Well, Minnie, what do you propose to do? I take it Mrs. Pringle can't put you up, and you certainly can't stay here. You really must try and get Bert to go away if he's becoming violent. Minnie looked vaguely surprised and wriggled nearer the edge of the chair. As expected, it tipped forward and pitched her onto the carpet, where she remained seated, looking perfectly at ease. Oh, I don't want Bert to go. He's a good chap apart from the strap. I dare say he'll be all right if I gets him a good bit of steak for his tea. I began to feel somewhat dizzy. This frequently happens during a conversation with Minnie. She veers from one point to another like a storm-battered weathercock. Surely that will cost a mint of money. I shouldn't feel inclined to cook an expensive steak for someone who hit me. Only with a strap, said Minnie earnestly. Could have been his belt. Buckle end. I gave up and rose to end the interview. Your money's on the mantel shelf, I said wearily. She gave me a radiant smile. Do just right for Bert's steak, she said, reaching for the handle brush. But I got there first. Not long after this encounter, the village was staggered to hear that Mrs. Cogg had been caught shoplifting in Caxley and was due to appear in court. I could not believe it when Mrs. Pringle informed me of the fact. But it seems so absurd, I protested, when she's better off now than she ever was. She told me herself that she'd never had so much money to manage on. That's why she went to Caxley, said Mrs. Pringle with a trace of smugness which riled me. When she didn't have no money to spend, she stayed home. Come she got to the shops in Caxley, she was tempted and fell. It all seemed very odd and very sad to me. What had she bought? I asked. Mrs. Pringle bridled. She never bought. That was the trouble. She thieved. As far as I can gather, it was things like rashers and sausages and a great bag of them frozen chips. At least a change from bread and sauce, I thought, though no doubt the poor children were still having that ghastly fare. Perhaps she just forgot to pay, I said. It happens. Mrs. Pringle snorted. Likely, ain't it? Anyway, she said straight out she'd nicked 'em. Her dour countenance showed a rare streak of pleasure. You reckon she'll get put inside? Fancy them both being in prison at the same time. I shouldn't think so for a moment, I said shortly. And isn't it about time the stoves were filled? If looks could have killed, I should have been a writhing corpse by the fire guard. But I was only vouchsafed the back view of my cleaner, retreating from the fray with a heavy limp. Most people, it transpired, felt as bewildered as I did at Mrs. Cogg's behavior, and the general feeling in the village was one of sympathy. The vicar had promised to appear in court to speak on her behalf, and one of Mr. Lovejoy's juniors was to appear for her. Mrs. Cogg herself, I heard, hardly seemed to realize what was happening. She made no attempt to excuse her actions, not in any mood of defiance, but simply in her usual mood of apathy. It was all very puzzling. One butcher's comments seemed to echo Mrs. Pringle's way of thinking. She's a poor tool, as we all know, Miss Reed. Let's face it, she wasn't born over bright, and any wits she have been knocked out of her by Arthur. I reckon she got carried away when she saw all the things in Caxley. But she's better off now than ever, I repeated. Yes, but not all that much better off. I mean, she'd had a taste of spending a bit extra, and it's gone to her head. When she lives as she usually does, it's hand to mouth. She comes in here for a chop for Arthur, never anything for herself and the children. To tell you the truth, I've often given her meat scraps and told her to make a stew or a pudding, but it's my belief she doesn't know how to cook at all. How they manage, I can't think. Another customer arrived, and we were forced to terminate our conversation, but it gave me food for thought. We all agreed that this was a first offense, and so imprisonment was surely out of the question, although Mr. Roberts, with unusual severity, said it might be an example to other light-fingered neighbors. However, as we heard later, 20 or so sheep belonging to him had that night been stolen from the downs within 2 miles of his home, and naturally his judgment was colored by his loss. "And if she's fined, then who is to pay it?" asked another. "The Social Security people, meaning us?" "She might just get a ticking off," said one hopeful. "That Colonel Austin's got a sharp tongue, they tell me, especially with poachers." "She might get a conditional discharge," said Mr. Lamb, with such authority that his few customers awaiting their pensions or postage stamps began to wonder if he had first-hand knowledge of courts and their procedure. It was thus that we anticipated the court's decision. Meanwhile, we had to wait and hope that, when the time came, Mrs. Cogg's case would evoke mercy as well as justice from the bench. Chapter 16. Snow. The end of the Christmas term came suddenly upon us, and we were caught up in a whirl of parties, concerts, and carol services. Add to these school and village activities were the personal ones of shopping for Christmas presents, trying to find out the correct time to post parcels to friends overseas, and stocking the larder for what looked like being the longest public holiday on record. "You wouldn't think the country was dead broke," commented Peter Hale acidly when I met him in the village street, "when you hear that the local factories are closing until January the 4th or roundabout." I found myself buying mounds of food against the siege and having considerable difficulty in packing it away. Does everyone, I wondered, as I stacked away tins of this and that, imagine that starving families are going to arrive after all the shops have shut and will be obliged to stay for days because of sudden blizzards? I always overestimate my own and my imaginary visitors' needs at these times and never learn my lesson. Because of this unwanted bustle, the question of the closure of Fair Acre School seemed to be in a state of suspended animation, and I was relieved to have something else to worry over. But all too soon, the festivities were over, the Christmas decorations were taken down, I continued to eat leftovers, and term started. It was quite apparent that we were in for a bleak spell of weather. The wind had whipped round to the northeast, and every night brought us frost. The ground was sodden after the heavy rains of autumn, and long puddles in the furrows froze into hard ice. At the sides of the lanes of Fair Acre, more ice lay in the gutters, and the children had a wonderful time making slides on their way to school. "Cruel weather," said Mr. Willett. "My greens look fair shrammed. What with the weather and the pigeons and all them other birds, I sometimes wonders why I bothers to grow 'em. If I had my way, I'd stick to root crops, but my old woman says we must have a bit of winter green, so I does my best. 'Tis a thankless task, though, when the winter's like this." "As long as we don't get snow," I said. Mr. Willett looked surprised. "Snow?" he echoed. "You'll get that aplenty, my dear, and afore the week's out, too." As usual, he was right. It began during the dinner hour, while the children were tearing about digesting, I hoped, steak and kidney pie and pink blancmange. Hilary was on playground duty, and I was cutting up painting paper for the afternoon session when the classroom door burst open to reveal a knot of panting children proudly displaying the spatters of snow on their clothing. "Snowin', miss! Ain't it lovely? It's snowin', and it's layin' too!" They were much too excited to have understood the difference in the uses of to lie and to lay, and anyway, I've almost given up hope of any success in that direction. I contented myself with telling them to let Miss Norman know they must all come into school. They clanged over the door scraper with enough noise for a mechanized army, and I went to the window to see the worst. The snowflakes were coming down in great flurries, whirling and turning until the eyes of the beholder were dazzled. The icy playground was white already, and the branches of the elm trees would soon carry an edging of snow several inches deep. Across the playground, sitting inside the window of my dining room, I could see Tibby watching the twirling flakes as interestedly as I was doing. The snow hissed against the glass, but that sibilant sound was soon drowned in the stamping of feet in the lobby and the excited voices of the children. I could see we were in for a boisterous afternoon. Wind is bad enough for raising children's spirits to manic level. Snow is an even more potent force. I judged it best to give out the paints and paper as soon as the register had been called, for it was quite apparent that my voice could never compete with the drama that was going on outside the windows. "You can paint a snow scene," I said, working on the principle that if you can't beat your rival, you join him. "What's that?" asked Ernest. Our Fair Acre children are chary of anything involving the imagination. If I had told them to paint the tasteful arrangement of dried flowers and leaves concocted by Amy and kept on my desk, they would have set to without a word. But to be asked to create a picture from nothing, as it were, filled them with dismay. I used to be rather hard on them, refusing to suggest themes and urging them to use their imaginations, but they are genuinely perturbed by these forays into the unknown, and advancing age has made me somewhat kinder. "Well, now you can make a picture of yourselves running about in the snowy playground, or making a slide." "Or a snowman?" suggested Patrick in a burst of inspiration. "Quite. Or a picture of men clearing the snow away from the roads, perhaps digging a car out of a snowdrift." "Or a bus," said Ernest. "Only I ain't got much red for a bus. Might do a tractor." They seemed to be fairly launched now, and they began their attempts without too much hesitation. A fierce argument broke out at one point about the best way of depicting snowflakes, which looked black as they came down, but which one knew were white really, and anyway turned white when they reached the ground. Linda Moffat said she was going to leave spots of paper showing through her sky to look like snow. Joseph Cogg said they'd look like stars then. And anyway, the sky wasn't blue like that, it was gray sort of. Altogether, it was a distracting art session, considerably enlivened by the constant uprising of children looking to see how deep the snow was in the playground. Certainly, by the time their afternoon break arrived, the snow was thick enough for Hilary to consult me about sending the infants home early. "I think the whole school had better go home early," I replied. The sky was low and heavy with snow to come, and there was no respite from the blizzard around us. The news was greeted with even greater excitement. One or two were apprehensive because their mothers were still at work. "I knows where our key is," said one. "It's in the secret place in the coal hole. I can easy get in." "Old Bert can come in my house till his mum gets back," offered another, and gradually we were able to account for all the children's safety from the storm. Except, as it happened, for the Cogg's children. No one seemed to offer to have them. Mrs. Coggs was out at work and would not be home until after 3:30. I was not very surprised that there were no invitations from the other children. For one thing, the Coggs had no near neighbors with children at the school. For another, the Coggs family has always been a little ostracized by the more respectable villagers, and I had a suspicion that since Mrs. Cogg's shoplifting escapade, the family was even less popular. So far, her case had not been heard, but as she herself admitted her guilt, there were quite a few who censored her and the innocent children. "You'd better come home with me," I said to the three, "and I'll run you home when your mother is back." They waited patiently by the tortoise stove, warming their grubby hands, while Hilary and I buttoned and tied the others into their outdoor clothes and threatened them with all manner of retribution if they forbore to go straight home. They vanished with whoops of joy into the veils of snow which swept the outside world, and I ushered my three visitors across the playground to my warm sitting room. I had had the foresight to light the fire at dinner time, and by now it was a clear red glow ideal for making toast, which no doubt would be welcomed before taking the children home. Joseph was inclined to be unusually self-confident in front of his little sisters, After all, his attitude seemed to say, I know this place, you don't. They watched me cut some substantial slices of bread. The toasting fork intrigued them, and I set them to making toast while I brewed a pot of tea, which I really did not need, but it made an excuse to pass the time before Mrs. Coggs returned. Their faces were flushed with heat and excitement. They handled the toast reverently. "Never cooked toast," announced Joseph. "Never knew a fire done cookin' like this." I remembered that the council houses had a closed stove for cooking and heating the water. But surely there was an open fire in the living room? "We never lights that," said Joseph, slightly shocked. "Us has the electric if it's cold." And pretty cheerless, too, I thought. No wonder that the children enjoyed my fire and their first attempts at toast making. They demolished several slices of their handiwork, plentifully spread with butter and honey. Outside, the snow drifted along the window ledges and settled on the roofs and hedges. It was time we made a move before the snow became too deep to open the garage door. Mrs. Coggs had just arrived home when we reached their house. I saw them indoors with a sinking heart. It looked as sordid and certainly as smelly as ever. Driving back through the driving snow, I pondered on the differences between neighbors and their surroundings in such a tiny place as Fair Acre. I was not comparing the fairly well-to-do, such as the Mauns and Hales, with those who had very little, but people like the Willets, for instance, or my sparring partner, Mrs. Pringle, who really had no more money coming into their homes than Mrs. Coggs had at the moment. In most of the homes in Fair Acre, one could be sure of finding a welcome. There would be a fire in winter, a cup of tea or coffee offered, biscuits or a slice of homemade cake, or a glass of homemade wine, deceptively innocuous, incidentally, put into one's hand. The house would be as welcoming as the householder. There would be the smell of furniture polish, the gleam of burnished brass and copper, and a bunch of flowers from the garden standing on the windowsill. It was lucky that Mrs. Coggs was in the minority in our little community, I thought, as I put away the car and shuffled through the snow to my own home. But hard luck on those children. And we'll follow winter in Fair Acre more next time.